One South Africa says it's deeply concerned about the United States government's decision to pause over $400 million in PEPFAR funding for AIDS relief and HIV and AIDS programs in South Africa. The party says it will formally petition US President Donald Trump through his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to reverse this decision and reaffirm the United States' commitment to global health and humanitarian assistance. We now speak to party leader Mmusi Maimane. Mmusi, appreciate your time. Thank you so much for staying on the line. Can you elaborate for us on how PEPFAR funding has historically supported South Africa's HIV/AIDS programs and the immediate effects of this suspension that we're witnessing?
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to fellow South Africans. It's been a crucial component of the twofold work that South Africa has had to do as it pertains to fighting the issue of HIV and AIDS. You will recall quite intentionally that at the peak of the HIV pandemic, as more infections were rising, PEPFAR was able to not only fund NGOs who were doing a lot of work on educating, but it was also in the healthcare sector helped to buttress some of the budget in providing nurses, treatment, and ARVs. And so naturally, this fulfills a significant amount of our budget. It's in the billions. And so the victims in this issue are not going to be the government in the sense that the political bilateral impasses and policy decisions that have been made. It's going to be the HIV patient, the young person who can't find prevention from mother to child treatment. All of those types of interventions are going to be what is impacted. And therefore, when we look at this issue, it is fundamental that we engage the United States, focus on PEPFAR, and also remind ourselves that part of this is what happens in the SADC region. As you know, that the virus does not remain in one country, it spreads across multiple countries, and we've been supportive to Botswana and multiple other countries. So it's going to be important that we fight this particular one and ensure that the funding continues. It also means for many NGO workers who are heavily reliant on PEPFAR funding will now be unemployed. So it cannot just be quick to say the US must just go jump or be dismissive about the issue. What we need is bilaterals. We need to engage the United States. We need clarity, but we also need to strengthen partnership with South Africa, because it's not just PEPFAR that will be impacted, it's AGOA and it's other sense at which global trade, as US is one of the largest trading partners to South Africa, we have to retain those.
And obviously the implications are far-reaching, as you articulate. What's prompted BOSA to take a leading role in petitioning the US government, and what are the expected outcomes?
The fundamentals are, as even the US Senate on Africa Affairs, there has been a lot of misinformation about what in fact policy positions have been, where South Africa is at. I think more than anything, for us as a centrist party, we feel that to align with extremist views is not going to serve the South African who is fighting to live with HIV, or the South African whose job is dependent on AGOA being in place, a currency that cannot afford more volatility. So we felt it was absolutely crucial that not only do you bring a sense of clarity, but you begin to take a posture that says, if foreign policy must be built on human rights and trade with the US remains important. And so we believe that if we're going to achieve that 5% GDP growth, you cannot dismiss the United States out of this equation. And so we felt it was crucial that we put a different view, because others who have gone there before have positioned the view that we're living with its effects today. As you will recall, many who are starting to say things like there are farm, there's genocide taking place, there's land seizures. Much of that misinformation needs to also be dispelled, and we need to be able to give an appropriate leadership and voice on a global platform on these issues.
Now, the US has said, or it is believed, that the reason that this $400 million and certainly other aspects of funding are now suspended or being withheld is largely due to the land expropriation bill and some of those policies. Now, how do you draw a line between the sovereignty of a country such as South Africa, who's instituted expropriation laws, which is largely part of the Constitution, and the desire by the United States to almost hold South Africa to ransom? And should there be a link between politics and help and the support of individuals in the country, as you say, who aren't politicians?
I think the first thing that all of us must realize is that given the bill, given bilaterals, there's a lot of distortion of what the bill seeks to do. But more importantly, there is no country in the world that does not have an expropriation bill. I think that's the first thing that we need to be clear about. The debate correctly must be on what the compensation is. And my reading says that the courts have been adequately capacitated to be the determinants of what the compensation must look like. Now, with those two conditions on the table, I think that if we were able to table a growth plan that said, here's what 5% growth is like, anyone who wants to expropriate, perhaps maybe for the building of an airport, building of road infrastructure, other infrastructure, all of us as South Africans, black and white, would support that view. I think there are some suspicions that some of this bill is driven so that it can benefit private individuals. That's not what we should be allowing. What we all arbitrary land seizures, which are not happening. What needs to be focused on is what is the economic growth thesis around expropriation. And therefore, once that clarity is on the table, US companies must be attracted to be able to invest here in South Africa. Tourists must be on the table. So for me, the point about bringing up clarity on expropriation is important, and also aligning all of South Africa's interests. I think for any white South African who genuinely believes that actually having an economy where a few are benefiting and many lie in a sea of poverty really is missing what the South African crisis is. The South African crisis is the fact that we've got two nations. We've got some that is super wealthy and a majority that is incredibly poor. To resolve that, it is in the interest of all South Africans, black and white, that we put our hands together to do that. And part of restitution and redress must be seen as bringing stability to a country that can ill afford the inequality it faces and can ill afford the sort of enclave of wealth and a sea of poverty. We must align all interests, and wherever they come from, public, private, political, we must come together at this moment and focus on our growth objectives. And that should be the clarion call. And so that anyone who comes to speak on an international platform, whatever party, whatever institution, must speak from those objectives rather than serving narrow, partisan, divisive, and at times, at worst, fairly racist perspectives.
Do you get the impression that Donald Trump and his administration seems to be overarching a little bit? Now, part of this conversation speaks to some grey areas. And as you've said, the judiciary, if you will, is in a position, have been heavily equipped to look at every single situation and determine the merits of it. Now, Donald Trump's administration is acting on a situation that actually hasn't occurred. Should they have paid more attention to what the bill seeks to do before instituting these bans or withdrawal of this amount of money?
I think part of what we need to realize is that in a multipolar universe, bilateralism and multilateralism is going to matter. I think we are starting to experience the fact that South Africa and any other part of the world, there is deep interconnectedness. And on the basis of that, we need to realize that if one economy suffers, the others follow likewise. And as global demand increases, all of us can benefit through that. So now the conversation must be had about how do we lead through a multilateral world. And whatever policy decisions, land is but one type of economic infrastructure. We're going to have a conversation about digital infrastructure, which is going to spread across multiple countries. We will soon be having conversations about currency, which will spread across multiple countries, which will ask questions about tax and jurisdiction, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a moment to lead in a multipolar universe. So what President Trump is realizing is that actually he's trying to hark back to an America First universe where he's trying to withdraw from global multilateralism. And I don't think it serves the US well, it doesn't serve Africa well, it doesn't serve anyone well. That's why it's important that we engage as equals to be able to chart our way forward in where better and deeper cooperation is going to come through, whether it's on viruses, as we saw on COVID, whether it's on this particular issue on policy. What I do want to urge, though, Hugo, which is absolutely vital in this regard, is that we need to realize as South Africa is that in articulating our own shared interest, we must be careful not to create outside agencies as spokespeople for what is happening domestically on incorrect information. One of my worries about the developments that have taken place recently is what happens when, for argument's sake, a murder takes place and it happens to be on a farm. Do people then tend to legitimize views that are put forward from the US on the back of that in a country where actually murder is occurring everywhere? And that doesn't justify another murder. It simply says we need to be sober about what we communicate. Or when the government, in fact, does put an economic policy to be able to drive a sense of expropriation. So I'm wanting to be very cautious and ask all South Africans, let us have our own internal dialogue, set our own priorities, and all of us need to be able to put those forward to a global community. That's why this national dialogue is a vital piece that says the next CODESA must be about us achieving what is economic inclusion for all South Africans, so that we all know that our interests are shared. When a currency falls, all of us suffer. And when pronouncements, for example, that are being made currently, the impact isn't just on one race, it's on all of us as South Africans. That's why our interests are interlinked, and we need to come back to a table and articulate a way forward.
I'm glad you raised that issue of interlinked interests, and you speak about us for us. Now, Solidarity in Africa Forum, at a media briefing yesterday, said that they would be going to the US to appeal against various sanctions of sorts, if you will, that have been imposed on South Africa, particularly in light of this expropriation bill. Are you going to be working with those organisations or similar organisations? Because one would imagine that a concerted effort by all South Africans, regardless of race, would potentially yield better results.
What is necessary for parties like AfriForum, etc., is that rather than them going on a sole mission, they must become part of the efforts that South Africans in total are bringing together. So if we want to work together, the reason we started Build One South Africa is because we genuinely believe in the one South Africa. And whatever race, whatever language, whatever gender, we need to come together and set up a working task team or envoys that represents multiple interests in this country to be able to represent one view as we arrive to the US. When you've got parties who sometimes arrive there for narrow interests, on what basis are they able to say they represent all of South Africans? So we need a concerted effort, and I'll be reaching out to all various role players to say, let us find each other on multiple issues, so that when we define how we want to see development, this is the pathway we're going to go, and all of us must contribute to that. So that when we go, whether it be the US, whether it be China, whether it be the EU countries or the rest of Africa, we need to come together with a unified story. And that's why it's important now more than anything to give domestic leadership, not only international leadership. Given the fact that South Africa will also be chairing the G20 summit, we need domestic leadership that presents united South African interests across the board. Because if this moment brings a division on our country, the impact will be severe on all of us. And we can't afford a nation divided. We need to build a one South Africa that ultimately delivers shared prosperity.
Finally, Mmusi, we've talked about HIV and AIDS and the implications of that $400 million funding that's now been suspended. What are the conversations that you're likely to have? What should the leadership of South Africa be having immediately? Because with that suspension, it has implications on millions of individuals that were benefiting from PEPFAR support.
Well, as the chair of the Appropriations Committee, we'll certainly be looking at how the budget responds to this particular issue. Because when it's said and done, what countries cannot do is not, it's important that South Africa be able to finance its own health objectives. And so we've got to figure out a way to do that. And that will have some implications. For example, when you look at the health budget itself, we've had a number of medical legal claims that have exacerbated where the health budget goes. We've had incidents where certain infrastructure has been poor. And in programs, for example, government has seen some of the wasteful expenditure. So we need to eradicate all of that if we're going to plug a hole in this regard. We need better partnerships, particularly in the SADC region, to say, how do we manage this response in making sure that Africa is able to be resilient in terms of its own financing going forward, of its own programs, and ultimately in our engagements globally. The reality of it is that in a world that is interconnected, viruses, climate change, all of these issues need global solidarity and response. And I think we need to be consistent on our foreign policy, look at how we finance and plug a hole in this regard, and then who are our partners in order to chart our way going forward. And so we'll be looking through it with great caution from an appropriations committee point of view equally so.
Mmusi Maimane, always good to speak to you. Appreciate your time.